When You Need a Missionary Story by Elizabeth B. Jones. Story 1. A Little Boy Who Listened to God. David Livingstone. How does it feel to be shaken by a lion, much as a cat shakes a mouse? David Livingstone knew, for he had that happen to him when he was a missionary to Africa. But that was only one of the many exciting things that happened to him in that dark land. David was a small boy in Scotland when God first spoke to him about doing something special for him. David was a poor boy who had to quit day school and go to work in a cotton mill when he was only 10 years old. But with the first money he earned, he bought a book and kept up with his studies while he worked. Although he had to work 10 hours a day in the factory, he studied while he worked and then went to school at night. David didn't know what God wanted him to do yet, but he was sure it was something very special. He wanted to learn all he could and prepare himself for whatever that something special might be. When he was about 20 years old, he knew that God wanted him to be a missionary. Later, when he met Robert Moffat, a missionary to South Africa, he knew where God wanted him to go. For many years, Africa had been a dark and almost forgotten land. People of other lands knew very little about this country, which was surrounded almost entirely by water. There was no inviting beaches and wide harbors to invite people to come. Instead, there were high walls of land and rocky hills along the coast. And in the north, there were miles and miles of sand and waterless desert to shut people out. So it was that if people thought of Africa at all, it was to wonder about the stories they had heard, stories of wild animals, fierce warlike people, many evil spirits, and cruel slave traders. But no one really knew for sure what Africa was like, for it kept its secrets tightly locked behind its great wall of water, rock, and sand. Missionaries had gone to South Africa with the story of Jesus, but no one had dared to go into the middle of Africa. There were no maps to guide them and no one to tell them what the country and the people were like. But it was to the middle of Africa that God called David to go as a missionary. David was not afraid to answer that call, but he knew that he needed to know many things. He studied medicine to be able to take care of himself and others. He studied botany to learn about the plants and trees, and zoology to learn the ways of animals. He studied geology to learn about land, and astronomy to help him find his way across a mapless land. And of course, he studied the Bible, so that he could teach the heathen people of Africa about God. At last, he was ready to go where there were no doctors, teachers, hospitals, churches, other missionaries, or even a map to guide them. But he was not afraid, for he knew that God would go with him. For over 30 years, David Livingstone traveled up and down Africa, treating the sick, helping those in need, teaching the gospel, and studying the land. There were many dangers, wild animals, snakes, and even cannibals. Often he was hungry and thirsty. There were fevers, sickness, accident, and other hard things, but he never gave up. The natives learned to love him and would do anything for him. It was a native who risked his own life to save Mr. Livingstone when the lion attacked him. For years at a time, he never saw a white man or received a letter from home. But he read his Bible every day and spent much time in prayer. When he was starving in rags and worn out with sickness and fever, his faithful black men stood by him. Then one day, while he was far away from home and loved ones, his faithful servant found him on his knees. He had gone to heaven while listening to God in prayer. All his life he had listened to God. First it was as a boy in Scotland, then as a young man preparing for his work, and finally as he gave his whole life for the people of Africa. When his work was over, he was still listening to God in prayer. After his death, his faithful, loving friends carried his body through the jungle to the coast. It took 9 months to do it, and it was a great risk and danger to them, but they were glad to do it for their beloved friend. Today, there are many people in Africa who love God. There are many hospitals, schools, and churches because a boy listened when God called him.